I thought spending the summer on Grandpa's farm would be the perfect way to clear my head. I'd just gotten out of a toxic relationship and needed a fresh start, a place far away from the city, where I could think, breathe, and maybe even find myself again. What I didn't expect was how much more I would discover. The dusty gravel road stretched out endlessly before me, flanked by rolling hills and golden fields of wheat. As my car rattled its way toward the farmhouse, I felt a strange mix of nostalgia and unease. It had been years since I'd last visited Grandpa's farm, and the memories of simpler times flooded my mind. When I pulled up to the house, Grandpa was already waiting for me on the porch. He stood tall for his age, his silver hair catching the sunlight, his posture as strong and confident as ever. "Ellie," he said, a wide smile spreading across his face as I stepped out of the car. "You've grown into a fine young woman." "Hi, Grandpa," I said, grinning as I walked up to him. He pulled me into a firm hug, the kind that made you feel safe and loved, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. "Come on in," he said, leading me inside. It's been too long. The house hadn't changed much since my childhood. The same creaky floorboards, the same curtains framing the windows, even the faint smell of coffee and earth that seemed to linger in the air. "You still keeping everything the same?" I teased as we sat down at the kitchen table. "Why change a good thing?" he replied, chuckling. The days that followed were simple but fulfilling. I helped Grandpa feed the animals, mend fences, and tend to the vegetable garden. He seemed grateful for the company, and I found solace in the quiet rhythm of farm life. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Ellie," he said one evening as we sat on the porch, watching the sunset. "Your mom would be proud of you." "Thanks, Grandpa," I said softly, the mention of my late mother tugging at my heart. He reached over and gave my hand a squeeze, his touch warm and steady. "We've got each other now," he said. "That's what matters." As the days turned into weeks, I began to notice little things about Grandpa that I hadn't seen before. The way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the strength in his hands as he worked, the quiet confidence he carried even in the face of hard work and solitude. One afternoon, as we worked together in the barn, he paused to wipe the sweat from his brow and smiled at me. "You've got a knack for this," he said, nodding toward the stack of hay bales I'd arranged. "Guess I take after you," I replied, grinning. He chuckled, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than usual. "You've grown into quite the woman," he said, his tone soft. I felt my cheeks flush and quickly looked away, brushing off the comment with a laugh. "Hard work will do that to you." But later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd said it, the way his eyes had softened when he looked at me. It happened one evening after a long day of work. We were sitting on the porch again, the cool breeze carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. Grandpa poured us each a glass of iced tea, and we sat in comfortable silence, watching the fireflies dance in the fading light. "You've brought new life to this place," he said suddenly, his voice low. "What do you mean?" I asked, turning to look at him. "This farm's been quiet for too long," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's good to have someone here again." "To have you here?" His words warmed me in a way I couldn't quite explain. "I'm glad I came," I said softly. He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine. "Me too," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, the air between us felt different, heavier, charged. But then he looked away, and the moment passed, leaving me with a strange sense of longing I couldn't quite place. The next day, things felt different. Grandpa was his usual cheerful self, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. Every glance, every touch, seemed to carry a weight that hadn't been there before. As we worked together in the garden, he reached out to steady me when I stumbled over a loose stone. His hand lingered on my arm for just a second too long, and when I looked up at him, his eyes met mine with an intensity that made my heart skip a beat. "Careful there," he said, his voice warm but steady. "Thanks," I murmured, quickly looking away. The rest of the day passed in a blur, my thoughts racing as I tried to make sense of the strange new dynamic between us. That evening, as we sat down to dinner, Grandpa surprised me by pouring us each a glass of wine. Special occasion? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Just thought we deserved it, he said, smiling. We talked and laughed as we ate, the tension from earlier fading into the background. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't help but notice the way his eyes lingered on me, the way his smile softened whenever our gazes met. When the meal was over, he stood and reached for my plate, his hand brushing against mine. The contact sent a jolt through me, and I quickly pulled my hand back, my cheeks flushing. Sorry, he said, his voice low. It's okay, I said, my heart racing. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words, and as I looked at him, I realized that whatever was happening between us was no longer something I could ignore. The air between us felt heavier after that evening, though neither of us said a word about it. Grandpa kept his usual steady demeanor, but I noticed the way his eyes lingered when he thought I wasn't looking, the small hesitations in his movements when we were close. I wasn't sure what to make of it, what to make of myself. Was I imagining it? Reading too much into his kindness? Or was there truly something unspoken growing between us? It happened one quiet afternoon. I was in the kitchen, scrubbing a stubborn stain off a frying pan, when Grandpa walked in, wiping his hands on a rag. Need a hand? He asked, his voice light. I think I've got it, I replied, smiling. He leaned against the counter, watching me for a moment before speaking. You've been working hard, he said softly. I don't know what I'd do without you here. I laughed, trying to lighten the mood. Probably get things done twice as fast without me slowing you down. He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine as he took the pan for me. Don't say that, he said, his voice firm. This place wouldn't be the same without you. I looked up at him, my breath catching as our eyes met. The space between us seemed to shrink, the world outside the kitchen fading into nothing. Grandpa, I began, my voice trembling. But before I could say anything more, he stepped back, his expression conflicted. I'll finish this, he said quietly, turning away. That night, I couldn't sleep. The memory of his touch, the look in his eyes. It was all too much. I found myself wandering into the living room, where Grandpa sat in his favorite armchair, staring into the flickering flames of the fireplace. You're up late, he said, glancing at me as I entered. Couldn't sleep, I admitted, sitting down on the couch. For a while, we sat in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Then he spoke, his voice low. I've been thinking a lot lately, he said.
About you.
About us. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned to look at him. What do you mean? He hesitated, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. I care about you, Ellie, he said finally. More than I should. His words hung in the air, and I felt my chest tighten. I care about you too, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mix of longing and fear. This isn't right, he said, his voice breaking. I don't know what's happening to me. It's not just you, I said, my heart racing. The silence between us was deafening, and for a moment, I thought he might say something more. But then he stood, his shoulders slumping. We should go to bed, he said quietly. Yeah, I murmured, my voice shaking. As I lay in bed that night, I couldn't stop replaying his words in my mind. The days that followed were tense, but we both tried to act normal. Grandpa was kind and patient as always, but there was a new distance between us, a carefulness in his actions that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, as we worked together in the garden, he reached out to steady me when I stumbled over a loose stone. His hand lingered on my arm for just a second too long, and when I looked up at him, his eyes met mine with an intensity that made my heart skip a beat. Careful there, he said, his voice warm but steady. Thanks, I murmured, quickly looking away. The rest of the day passed in a blur, my thoughts racing as I tried to make sense of the strange new dynamic between us. It happened one evening after dinner. We were sitting on the porch, the cool breeze carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. Grandpa poured us each a glass of iced tea, and we sat in comfortable silence, watching the fireflies dance in the fading light. You've brought new life to this place, he said suddenly, his voice low. What do you mean? I asked, turning to look at him. This farm's been quiet for too long, he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. It's good to have someone here again. To have you here. His words warmed me in a way I couldn't quite explain. I'm glad I came, I said softly. He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine. Me too, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, the air between us felt different. Heavier, charged. And then, slowly, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. Grandpa, I began, my voice trembling. He didn't pull away, his hand warm and steady against mine. Ellie, he said softly, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. Neither did I. Later that night, I found myself in the kitchen, pouring a glass of water. The house was quiet, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I turned to find Grandpa standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Couldn't sleep, he asked. No, I said, setting the glass down. He stepped closer, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. Ellie, he began, his voice trembling. Before he could say anything more, I closed the distance between us, my heart pounding. It's okay, I said softly. His hand brushed against mine, and the world seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, neither of us moved, the weight of our emotions pressing down on us. And then, slowly, he leaned in, his lips brushing against my forehead. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice breaking. It's okay, I said again, though my chest ached with a longing I couldn't explain. The next morning, everything seemed normal, or at least, that's what we pretended. Grandpa poured his coffee, I scrambled eggs, and we sat at the table like nothing had happened the night before. But the weight of his gaze and the quiet moments of hesitation in his movements spoke volumes. Got a busy day ahead, he said, breaking the silence. Yeah, I replied, my voice steady, though my heart was anything but. We worked side by side in the barn that day, mending a broken stall door and stacking hay bales for the horses. The rhythm of the work kept my thoughts at bay, but every now and then, I'd catch him looking at me, his expression soft, conflicted. Ellie, he said suddenly, his voice breaking the stillness. Yeah? I asked, turning to face him. He hesitated, his hands tightening around the hammer in his grasp. Never mind, he said, shaking his head. I didn't press him, though the knot in my stomach tightened. That evening, after we'd finished dinner and washed the dishes, Grandpa poured himself a glass of whiskey. I lingered in the kitchen, not wanting to retreat to my room just yet. You want one? He asked, holding up the bottle. I hesitated, then nodded. Sure. We sat together in the living room, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. You remind me of your mother, he said suddenly, his voice low. I looked at him, surprised. Really? He nodded, his gaze distant. She had the same way of lighting up a room. The same determination. The same strength. Thanks, I said softly, my chest tightening. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and something deeper. You've grown into an incredible woman, Ellie, he said, his voice trembling. My breath caught, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he stood abruptly, his movements sharp. I need some air, he muttered, disappearing out the front door. I sat there for a long time, staring into the fire, my mind racing. The next day, as we worked together in the garden, the tension between us seemed to ease, at least on the surface. We joked and laughed, the rhythm of our work grounding us in a sense of normalcy. You've got a green thumb, Grandpa said, nodding toward the row of perfectly planted tomatoes. Guess I've got a good teacher, I replied, grinning. He chuckled, his gaze warm. You've always had a knack for this. But later, as we loaded tools back into the shed, I stumbled over a loose stone, nearly losing my balance. His hand shot out to steady me, his grip firm and reassuring. Careful, he said, his voice soft. Thanks, I murmured, my cheeks flushing as I looked up at him. Our eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to fall away. His hands lingered on my arms, his touch warm against my skin. Ellie, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. But before he could say anything more, the sound of a car pulling up the driveway shattered the moment. The car door slammed and a familiar voice called out, "Dad? Ellie?" My stomach dropped as I recognized my uncle's voice. Grandpa stepped back quickly, his hands falling to his sides, his expression instantly guarded. "Over here," he called, his tone steady. Uncle Ben appeared a moment later, his expression cheerful as he approached the shed. "Thought I'd stop by and check in," he said, clapping Grandpa on the back. "Good to see you," Grandpa replied, forcing a smile. I tried to steady my breathing, plastering a neutral expression on my face. "Hi, Uncle Ben," I said, my voice steady. "How's my favorite niece?" he asked, grinning. "Good," I replied, though my hands trembled slightly as I wiped them on my jeans. He didn't seem to notice, chatting animatedly about his day and the latest news from town. But every now and then, his gaze would flicker between me and Grandpa, his brow furrowing slightly. That evening, Uncle Ben stayed for dinner, filling the air with his easy laughter and endless stories. But as the meal wore on, his tone shifted, his questions becoming more pointed. "You two have been spending a lot of time together," he said casually, his gaze flicking between us. "There's a lot to do around here," Grandpa replied evenly. "Sure," Ben said, his smile tight. "But you seem close." I felt my cheeks flush, and I quickly looked down at my plate. "She's family," Grandpa said firmly. "Of course," Ben replied, his tone light but his eyes sharp. The rest of the meal passed in tense silence, and by the time Ben finally left, my nerves were frayed. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard the faint creak of floorboards in the hallway. My heart raced as I sat up, listening intently. A soft knock sounded at my door, and I hesitated before answering. "Come in." Grandpa stepped inside, his expression conflicted. "I just wanted to check on you," he said quietly. "I'm fine," I said, though my voice trembled. He hesitated, then stepped closer. "Ben's suspicious," he said, his voice low. "I know," I replied, my chest tightening. "We have to be careful," he said, his eyes meeting mine. I nodded, my heart pounding. "I know." For a moment, neither of us moved, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. Then, slowly, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. "I don't want to lose you," he whispered. "You won't," I said softly. But even as I said the words, I knew it wasn't a promise I could keep. The next morning, the tension from Uncle Ben's visit lingered like a storm cloud. Grandpa seemed more distant, throwing himself into farm work with an intensity that left little room for conversation. I tried to match his energy, hoping the distraction would settle the nerves still churning in my stomach. But as we worked side by side in the barn, the silence between us felt heavy, filled with all the things we couldn't say. "Ben's just being nosy," I said finally, breaking the quiet. Grandpa paused, his hands tightening around the shovel in his grasp. "It's not just Ben," he said, his voice low. "What do you mean?" He looked at me then, his expression torn. "People talk, Ellie. In a town like this, they always do." His words sent a chill through me. "But we haven't done anything," I said quickly, though even I didn't believe it. He gave me a sad smile, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. "Sometimes, it doesn't matter what's true. It matters what people believe." That afternoon, as I was hanging laundry on the line, a car pulled into the driveway. I recognized the driver immediately, Mrs. Harper, a neighbor who had lived down the road for as long as I could remember. She stepped out, her sharp eyes scanning the yard before settling on me. "Ellie," she said, her tone polite but curious. "How are you settling in?" "Good," I replied, forcing a smile. "It's nice to be back on the farm." She nodded, her gaze lingering on me. "Your grandpa must be happy to have you here," she said. "He is," I said, my voice steady. Her lips curved into a faint smile, but there was something in her eyes that made my stomach twist. "It's always nice to see families sticking together," she said. "But you know how people love to gossip." The implication in her words was clear, and I struggled to keep my expression neutral. "Thanks for stopping by, Mrs. Harper," I said, my tone firm. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Take care, Ellie. As she drove away, I stood frozen in place, her words echoing in my mind. That evening, I found Grandpa sitting on the porch, staring out at the horizon. The whiskey glass in his hand was almost empty, and his expression was distant, troubled. Mrs. Harper came by today, I said, sitting down beside him. He didn't look at me, his gaze fixed on the fading light. What did she want? To check in, I said. And to remind me that people are watching. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he sighed, his shoulders slumping. Maybe this was a mistake, he said quietly. What? I asked, my chest tightening. Bringing you here, he said, his voice heavy. I didn't realize what people might say. This isn't your fault, I said firmly. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and longing. Isn't it? The days that followed were a blur of whispered conversations and stolen glances. Grandpa and I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. Uncle Ben returned the following weekend, his cheerful demeanor a stark contrast to the unease simmering beneath the surface. He spent most of the day chatting with Grandpa about farm business, but every now and then, I'd catch him watching me, his expression unreadable. Everything okay, Ellie? He asked at dinner, his tone casual but probing. Yeah, I said quickly, forcing a smile. You seem quiet, he said, his gaze lingering. Just tired, I replied, looking down at my plate. Grandpa shot him a warning look, but Ben didn't seem to notice. Or didn't care. You know, he said, leaning back in his chair, people in town have been asking about you too. What people? Grandpa asked, his tone sharp. Ben shrugged, his smile tight. Just neighbors. They're curious, that's all. The silence that followed was deafening, and I could feel the weight of Ben's gaze pressing down on me. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was falling apart. The whispers, the questions, the watchful eyes, it was all too much. I found myself wandering into the living room, where Grandpa sat in the dim light of the fireplace, his expression troubled. You should go back to school, he said as I entered. What? I asked, my heart sinking. It's not safe for you here, he said, his voice breaking. Not with the way people are talking. I'm not leaving, I said firmly. Ellie, he began, but I cut him off. No, I said, my voice trembling. I'm not running away just because people can't mind their own business. He looked at me, his eyes filled with pain. I don't want you to get hurt, he said softly. I'm not afraid, I said, stepping closer. For a moment, the air between us felt charged, electric. Then, slowly, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. I don't know what to do, he whispered. Neither do I admitted, my chest tight. The following day, the tension came to a head. Uncle Ben cornered Grandpa in the barn, his voice low but insistent as he asked pointed questions about me, about us. You need to be careful, Ben said, his tone sharp. People are starting to talk, Dad. And if you're not careful, they're going to come looking for answers. Grandpa's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might snap. But instead, he nodded, his voice steady. I'll handle it. You'd better, Ben said, his gaze hard. Because if you don't, they will. As Ben drove away that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was spiraling out of control. The quiet isolation of the farm was no longer a comfort. Every sound, every car that passed on the gravel road, sent a jolt of fear through me. Grandpa was quieter than ever, his usual steadiness replaced by a tension that radiated from him in every movement. Uncle Ben's warning hung over us like a storm cloud. The neighbors' whispers had grown louder, and the risk of exposure felt more real with each passing day. I can't let this continue, Grandpa said one evening, his voice heavy as we sat on the porch. What do you mean? I asked, my chest tightening. He looked at me, his expression pained. You deserve better than this, Ellie. Better than me. You don't get to decide that, I said firmly, tears pricking at my eyes. This isn't just about us, he said, his voice breaking. People are starting to talk. If they find out, let them talk, I said, my voice trembling. I don't care. But I do, he said softly, his gaze meeting mine. The next day, Uncle Ben showed up again, his face grim as he stepped out of his truck. We need to talk, he said to Grandpa, his tone leaving no room for argument. I watched from the kitchen window as they stood in the barn, their voices low but intense. Ben gestured sharply, his frustration evident, while Grandpa stood firm, his expression unreadable. When Grandpa finally came back inside, his face was pale, his shoulders slumped. What did he say? I asked, my heart pounding. He's giving us a warning, Grandpa said quietly. A warning? He's going to the sheriff if we don't stop this, he said, his voice trembling. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. He can't do that, I said, my voice rising. He can, and he will, Grandpa said, his eyes filled with despair. That night, the house was silent, the weight of Ben's ultimatum pressing down on us. I couldn't sleep, my mind racing with fear and anger. When I finally stepped out into the living room, Grandpa was there, sitting by the fireplace with his head in his hands. This has to end, he said, his voice breaking. No, I said, my voice firm. We can fix this. We can. There's no fixing this, Ellie, he said, his eyes meeting mine. Not without tearing everything else apart. Tears filled my eyes as I knelt in front of him, taking his hands in mine. I don't care what people think, I said, my voice trembling. But I do, he said softly. I care about you. And I can't let you ruin your life because of me. For a long moment, we sat in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. I think you should leave, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. What? I asked, my heart sinking. It's the only way, he said, his eyes filled with pain. You need to go back to school, to your life. Away from this, from me. The next morning, I packed my bags, my hands trembling as I folded my clothes and placed them into my suitcase. Grandpa didn't say much, his usual steadiness replaced by a quiet sadness that broke my heart. When it was time to leave, he walked me to my car, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I'm sorry, he said, his voice shaking. Don't be, I said, tears streaming down my face. I just want you to be happy, he said softly, his eyes meeting mine. I was happy here, I said, my voice breaking. He reached out then, his hand brushing against my cheek. Take care of yourself, Ellie, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You too, I said, my chest aching as I climbed into the car. As I drove away, the farmhouse shrinking in the distance, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving a piece of myself behind. Weeks passed, and life went on, though nothing felt the same. I threw myself into my studies, trying to distract myself from the ache in my chest. Uncle Ben's warnings faded into the background, the whispers from the neighbors growing quieter with time. But I couldn't forget. One evening, as I sat in my dorm room, staring at the photo of the farm I'd kept on my desk, my phone buzzed with a message. I miss you. My breath caught as I read the words, and for the first time in weeks, a small smile tugged at my lips. I miss you too, I replied, my heart pounding. Sometimes, love doesn't follow the rules. Sometimes, it doesn't make sense, but it's real. And sometimes, that's all that matters.